He has also played an important role in LLILAS in several ventures. He was associate director here between 2007 and 2009. He was also associate editor of Latin American Research Review, which we did together for several years.
5 years.
5 years. Well, you did it longer than I did.
That's true. That's true. You were a substitute.
I was substitute for Kurt. So Jonathan has published 4 solo-authored books. The first, The Socioeconomic History of Argentina, won the prestigious Bolton Prize. A second one, Oil and Revolution in Mexico, came out in '93. Then in 2005, he published A Social History of the Colonial Period, which won the Hamilton Book Award. And then more recently, A Brief History of Argentina, which was published in 2009. So this, it's my understanding, is your 5th book, correct?
That's right.
5th book.
Keep counting. Yeah. More to come, too.
And more to come, exactly. 2 of these books have been published and translated and published in Latin America already. He's also edited a collection of essays on workers and populism in the region, as well as edited books on the Mexican oil industry and on Argentine social history. So we're very happy to have him here presenting his most recent and perhaps his best book, we'll see. The discussant today will be Kurt Weyland, who is a professor of government who's been here also since 2002, I think, and is the author of numerous books on various topics from economic reform to democratization in Latin America. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Kurt. We're going to start with his remarks, and then we'll move to Jonathan.
Good. So before I start, I have to say a couple of personal things, because when I came from Germany many years ago, Jonathan doesn't want me to say how many years ago it was, but it was in the last millennium. When I came over as a little student, he was one of my first professors here, and I learned so much from him. So now it's really a very special thing for me personally to, as the former student, now get to speak about the book of the former professor, and especially because it's such a big and important and great book. So. The other thing is, I've only seen Jonathan in blue jeans and cowboy boots, so I meant no disrespect and not quite dressing up as much. I changed out of my blue jeans, but that's also, that's the reason. Because usually he has more of the Texan feel. So, good. Now, this book, as you can see, is a very well-researched, massive contribution. That's very important. And I mean, just the research as such is amazing in all the archives that he has worked and all the sources that he has invoked here, especially the work in Cuba that you got to do that kind of work. I mean, I think that's really a very important contribution. What I want to highlight more is the theoretical contributions of this book. So essentially kind of draw out the implications of the findings for important theoretical and substantive issues of US-Latin American relations. This very well-researched analysis makes a very important contribution to the most consequential and controversial phase of US-Latin American relations, namely the decade after the Cuban Revolution. It was during that decade when the United States was most involved in Latin America ever. Never before and never after was the United States so much involved. And so it's very important for assessing the role of the US in Latin American politics and development. Given that the US was so deeply involved, there are some very important questions that we need to ask. One is, were the US actions informed by realistic concerns, or were they driven by selfish interests or ideological paranoia? And then also, what were the consequences of US actions? I mean, after all, the 1960s was the decade when many of the harshest, most atrocious military regimes emerged in Latin America. And the big question is, to what extent was the United States responsible for that? Now, this question is of great theoretical significance because many scholars of Latin America used to stress the overbearing influence of the US as the regional hegemon. And so for a long time, kind of the prevailing view was that the United States held great responsibility for the emergence and consolidation of these dictatorships. You know, the times were when dependency theory, when theories of imperialism held great sway among scholars, and so the United States was seen as the decisive, or at least a very, very important force in installing and supporting these military regimes. The book is so important because it essentially shows that it is not the case. It is not the case. It essentially produces a lot of evidence showing that the United States was not the main promoter of these coups, that the United States certainly did not impose authoritarian rule on victims in Latin America. Instead, what it shows is that in all of these countries, domestic forces clearly played the most important role. Domestic forces held the main responsibility. With that basic thesis, with that basic argument, which is very well supported by thousands of documents, the book is part of a broader reconsideration of US-Latin American relations. You know, it follows on the analysis of Hal Brands, of Tanya Harmer, but it's much broader in scope, much more thoroughly researched than the Hal Brands book, and much broader than the Tanya Harmer book that focuses on Chile. And so it's a massive and very important contribution. It's interesting that this broader reconsideration of US-Latin American relations, which essentially shows the United States wasn't all that involved and didn't make all of that much of a difference, is in some sense the result of a paradoxical empirical development. It's essentially partly the result of the massive declassification of US documents and of the opening of archives in other countries. Many of the scholars of dependency and imperialism just assumed that the United States, with that great cloud, was behind a lot of these coups, that there were all these smoking guns hidden in the CIA and State Department archives, and just the United States was keeping them under control so that people wouldn't find them. So that's the reason why people like Peter Kornbluh incessantly pushed for declassification, FOIA requests, and all this stuff. So now there's been a lot of declassification, a lot of FOIA requests, and what showed up? Not many smoking guns at all. I mean, the smoking guns that supposedly were there, the United States stage managed these coups. Oops, you know, now that the archives are open, we see, there actually isn't all that much that the United States did to help promote these kinds of coups. So that's a very important null finding. But unfortunately, null findings don't have the impact that they in many ways should have. You know, essentially helps disprove those earlier arguments. What this opening of archives, especially after the fall of communism, also shows is that it wasn't only the United States that was deeply involved in Latin America, but a whole bunch of other countries, the Cubans and the Soviets and the Chinese and the Czechs and the East Germans and whatever, which of course also puts US involvement in a somewhat different perspective, because it wasn't just the United States that got involved in Latin America, but there were a whole bunch of other countries pushing their interests, projects, causes, ideologies, and so the US was, you know, to some extent or to a good extent, responding and trying to counteract what other people did. So what that means is the United States wasn't responding also to mere phantoms, but to some things that they saw in an exaggerated way as real challenges and real threats. The US in many ways felt compelled. You know, if you see all these other countries promoting interests and goals and causes and ideologies that are opposed to us, what do? You just sit at home and say, oh, well, we'll just let it happen. Or you say, oh, we have to somehow counteract this. And so what a lot of this recent literature has done, and what Jonathan does in a very convincing way, is put these Latin American developments in the broader context of the Cold War. And the Cold War, to some extent, wasn't, you know, kind of made acute and salient in Latin America by the US, but by the Cubans. I mean, the first part of the book shows how incessantly the Cubans promoted and exported guerrilla and revolution all over the place for many, many years. So, and the United States responded in a number of ways, not only with counterinsurgency, and as a dissertation done under Jonathan a year or two ago shows that counterinsurgency wasn't even as brutal as people often think. But the US also tried to respond with reforms, the famous Alliance for Progress, that didn't work out in a number of cases, but the US wasn't as kind of sledgehammer like imperialist, but tried to use a variety of strategies. So these are the important theoretical and empirical contributions that Jonathan's book makes, and I'm essentially trying to kind of sharpen the findings, which I think will be sufficiently controversial to stimulate some discussion later. And his book paints a much more nuanced, much more differentiated picture than people used to assume, based on these theories of dependency and imperialism and whatever. The book essentially depicts the United States not as the scheming imperialist, but kind of as the bumbling firefighter. They saw there was trouble from their perspective, and they somehow or other tried to help keep it under control. Very often they didn't have a very good grasp on what was going on. And interestingly, one thing that Jonathan emphasizes, especially in the chapter about Brazil, they were in some sense too much influenced by the domestic opposition. The domestic opposition in Brazil persuaded them that maybe President Goulart was planning a left-wing self-coup and was moving towards communism in a way that would undermine the democracy there. And so the US in some sense sort of fell for the arguments. Turns out it wasn't that the US spread these ideas, but they in some sense mistakenly bought into arguments that came from Latin American sectors themselves. Also, the US tried to cooperate with conservative opposition sectors down there, but of course those pushed their own agendas and weren't always trustworthy and reliable. So the US wasn't the imperialist puppet master, but more like the stumbling, bumbling giant trying to somehow keep things under control. One of the biggest mistakes was the United States clearly exaggerated the threat of communism. But there was an important kernel of truth. I mean, as Jonathan shows in his book, Fidel Castro incessantly promoted revolution and guerrilla problems. And of course, from the US perspective, the stakes were high. So the US misperceived the threat and suspected that every left-winger was a communism, and that was a clear mistake, which of course is easy to condemn in retrospect. But what we have to keep in mind is, in some sense, I think humankind in general has a tendency to over-perceive, to exaggerate, to overrate the threats they face. So it wasn't, how should I say that? It was kind of within the margin of human error. It wasn't something unusual that the US did. I think that's a common mistake. Also, the United States encouraged Latin Americans to watch these left-wingers and worry about communism and do something about it. But what is very, very clear, many, many Latin Americans didn't need the US to push that agenda on them. They themselves were more scared and more worried about these developments than many US policymakers. Obviously the stakes for them were much, much higher. As Jonathan emphasizes in the book, once Fidel Castro fusilated Batista's military leadership, you didn't have to persuade any general that a Cuban-style revolution would be a little dangerous for them in their own country. Once Fidel Castro nationalized a whole bunch of private businesses, you didn't have to persuade lots of business people that a profound transformation like that would be a problem and a threat. And so, the Latin American sectors, status quo sectors, businesses, conservative politicians, military leaders, they didn't need the US to warn them about the risk of leftist reforms and communism. So one of the most fundamental points that Jonathan makes in the book, and I think that's very important, is he documents Latin American agency. Latin America wasn't just the object of US pressure, the victim of US imposition. They had agency. In a number of cases, they held the US at bay. For example, in the Venezuelan case, the US pushed them in some directions, and they said, no, we don't want to do these things, we want to do other things. It wasn't that they were just kind of taking orders from the US. What it means is that it was mainly domestic actors that were responsible for the wave of coups and for the harsh repression that followed. The US played a role, the US had its hand in it, the US suggested, insinuated, promoted, later supported, condoned, excused, and whatever. But the main initiative was from Latin America. The US did not play the decisive role. What's also very important to keep in mind is that when we talk about these coups, not many people expected in Latin America, and especially in the US, that these coups would lead to the installation of long-term military dictatorships that would commit grievous human rights violations. The general sense was the Brazilian military would go in, as they had done before a few times, kind of ban a few politicians, throw out a president, hold new elections, and reopen the democratic game. In Chile, there was the same kind of idea. You know, they would kind of throw out Allende, but then they wouldn't like stay in power for 17 years. And the United States very, very clearly didn't want that. So when the Brazilian military regime, for example, became more and more repressive and more like, oh, you know, we have a long-term project, the US was like, no, we don't want that. We want you to re-democratize. We want you to open up. There's this guy, Kubitschek, who wants to be president in 1965, all the elections. So especially the kind of the hardcore insistence on long-term military rule was clearly a Latin American initiative that was not the preference of the United States. If you wanna put it in a slightly provocative fashion, and my role here is to kind of distill the main insights from the book and turn them into a slightly provocative fashion to have some discussion later. You can say that, I would say that all of these coups that happened in these countries would have happened anyway, even if the United States hadn't been involved. Sooner or later, these Latin Americans would have responded in that kind of way, because as I said, they had similar perceptions of threat, they had much higher stakes, and they would have acted sooner or later. Okay, so then one last point, which might be especially controversial, which is the book documents the misperceptions, the misjudgments, the problematic actions of US actors and Latin American right-wingers, conservatives, elites, generals, business people, whatever. But of course it also shows the striking and consequential misperceptions, misjudgments, and problematic actions of Latin American left-wingers. I mean, for so many years, Fidel Castro tried to export his revolution over and over again. I mean, you have here the Venezuelan picture. I mean, how many times did he send support and money and arms and trained guerrilla fighters to Venezuela? Latin American groupings for so many years made one ill-prepared guerrilla struggle after the other, over and over again. I mean, no learning, like, you know, it failed here, we won't do it there, no. Even, it's not part of the book because it's about the 1960s, even experienced politicians in Latin America, in retrospect, made decisions that you're just like wondering, where did they come from? You think of Salvador Allende, long-time parliamentarian in Chile, wins 36% of the vote and decides to push the country in a march to socialism. That fails, but I mean, 36% of the vote, and you want to push such a profound reform effort? I mean, what were you thinking? You know, in terms of kind of realistic assessment of political possibilities, which is the task of a politician, not just idealism and I want to do it, but can I do it? What are the chances? What are the risks? What are the potential consequences? What odd, let's call it odd decision. Okay? So the right overreacted, the right used overkill, the right committed terrible atrocities. Clearly they held the overwhelming predominant responsibility for these tragedies that emerged in so many countries, but the left made a whole bunch of mistakes as well. So what emerges from this book then is, by contrast to the old theories of dependency and imperialism and whatever, a much more nuanced, differentiated picture emerges. The United States played a significant role. The United States did many things that in retrospect, you know, they wouldn't be very proud of, and those kinds of things. But Latin Americans played a much, much bigger role. Latin American actors, the coups were mainly the responsibility of actors in Latin America, and while the right holds the main responsibility, the left didn't play all that glorious a role either. And so what you see is, of course, you know, political reality isn't black and white, it comes in all kinds of shades of gray, and this book does a great job essentially painting that and kind of clarifying, rectifying a whole bunch of views that still kind of hang around when you talk about US-Latin American relations in the 1960s and 1970s. And so I think it's a really important contribution, and as I said, I've just tried to kind of sort of sharpen the findings and conclusions. And if you find those comments that I made controversial, it was him who, it's him who can respond with like thousands of documents and show you that he was right. Okay, so thank you.
use the microphone. Thank you so much.
Okay, okay. Ahora somos todos descamisados. That was Juan Perón, 1946, consolidating the Peronist populist movement. Excuse me.
Sorry. Tripping up my own professor. I mean, what if you're broken a leg right now?
Spreading revolution.
Counter-revolution.
Thank you very, very much for those comments. I must say I trained him well. Any other of his former professors here? No, I think they've all died off. Long ago retired. But thank you for not mentioning how many years ago you had my class.
I'm surprised that he's avoided about that because I've lost way more hair than he has.
Rogaine does wonders for the old professors. A couple of comments that I'd like to make here, and a couple of things that he didn't mention. One is all of the research I was able to do in this kind of revealed the agency of small people. People who don't show up like Fidel Castro. I think Fidel Castro was the only person that you mentioned. But there were just hundreds of people who made their choice between the revolution and countering the revolution, who decided to leave the country and who took up arms against Fidel Castro. And the two things that make Fidel Castro's revolution so powerful is that it created this powerful counter-revolution. Everybody who had helped put Fidel in power, most of them from the middle class, and they didn't fight with him in the Sierra Maestra, but in other ways they were fighting in the cities. They were fighting even from exile in Miami during the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. But they were doing valuable work in the exile in Miami in the 1950s by convincing the State Department to stop delivering weapons to the army of Fulgencio Batista. Of course, my book doesn't really signal that, but these people came back and they expected to be part of the revolution, part of the revolutionary government. Those people who fought in the cities and sent arms up to the Sierra Maestra and sent money up to the Sierra Maestra, which Castro needed, how was he able to recruit and not alienate the peasants of the Sierra Maestra? Because people in the cities sent him money, and Fidel Castro, for purchasing food for his guerrillas, paid money for those supplies. So when Fidel Castro began to go to the left and eliminate one by one his middle-class former accomplices in the revolution against Batista, they then went into the counter-revolution. And they went off to Miami, and they had the help of the CIA. So there is some agency on the part of the United States in the CIA. And one of them was to strengthen the counter-revolution out of Miami. So all of the middle-class people went to Miami. Some of them, especially the young ones, said, I want to fight. And the means was given to them by the CIA. Chilo Borja, one of the people I interviewed in Miami, told me this great story. He had grown up in Cuba, and I'll tell you his story because it's so typical of former revolutionaries and opponents of Batista also becoming opponents of Fidel Castro. Chilo had gone to the university a Canadian university, so he spoke English very well. He went back after the Batista regime fell, and he fell in with his old students there, but the university was closed down. Not only that, the university was being taken over by communists without any announcements whatsoever. And this was the great thing that Castro had. He had a real sense of politics. He had a real sense of his final objective. And he carried it out. He had surrogates. He had people from the old Communist Party that had played no role in the revolution against Batista. He sent them to Moscow. And there they got the attention of the Kremlin. And the Kremlin began to think, well, maybe we could help this guy. Maybe he really is open to becoming communist and joining the Communist Party. So the communists were allowed to come into the revolution. And they just showed up without announcement. And this alienated some of those who had come back from exile and who had fought against Batista, not exactly alongside Fidel, but at least had fought on the same side of the revolution from Fidel. They became alienated because they saw all of those communists showing up. Now, the smart thing that Castro did, he never told them, I'm going to bring in the communists now because they're going to be good revolutionaries, and they're going to support me in power. They're going to support us all in power. So that individually, all of his opponents came out singly to oppose the communists. And once they did that, then Fidel was able to eliminate them one by one. A good case in point was the president of the government. His name was Judge Urrutia. He was a politician of no particular constituency in Cuba. Therefore, Fidel selected him to be president of the country. And he didn't have a big entourage behind him. He didn't belong to an important party from the 1940s. What a perfect person to be selected as your president, because you know sooner or later you can eliminate him. Urrutia thought he had power. He was president of the country. He lived in the presidential palace. But he was getting sick and tired of the communists showing up in the revolution, so he goes down to the local TV station and he announces on TV that a lot of people from the Communist Party are showing up and we ought to get rid of them. And next thing you know, Fidel Castro resigns